Hi, this is Kathy from Gadget Stop 321, and in today's video, I'm going to be taking a look at Iroshizuku Syo Ro. Now, Syo Ro is one of those bluish-green inks or greenish-blue inks that I have trouble showing the correct color of it on video. I will try my best to correct the colors so that it displays as accurately as possible, and I'll make a note right here describing how successful I was in that. But regardless, I will be able to describe how the ink performs in a variety of pens and nib sizes ranging from a Pilot Extra Fine to a 1.5 stub nib, and I'll be able to describe how the ink feels in a drier writing nib versus a wetter writing one, or a finer nib versus a broader nib. I'll be doing a writing sample on 52 GSM Tomoe River paper. I'll also take a look at some writing samples that I did earlier on other types of paper. I'll compare Iroshizuku Syo Ro to similar inks from my collection. And finally, I'll take a look at the results of my water resistance test. Writing with Iroshizuku Syo Ro using a glass dip nib was very pleasant. The ink came off the nib fairly uniformly, and it felt pretty smooth and satisfying as I was writing. The swatch that I made with tweezers went down very uniformly and was very crisp. The drip at the end of the swatch is not much darker than the swatch itself, but there is a dark halo that sheens kind of reddish pink. I'm going to begin my writing samples with a Pilot Kakuno. It has an extra fine stainless steel nib. This extra fine nib was very smooth with this ink, and the letters are nice and crisp. This was a very pleasant ink to use with this very fine nib, and I think it's fair to say that it was nice and smooth. Next, I'll be writing with a Pilot Prera. Still very pleasant. You can see that this fine nib is just a bit wider. Now, I do notice that as this ink dries, you can see here in the Prera, it's got almost a look of like faded blue jeans. As it dries, it gets a bit more pale, and I guess you see a bit of shading in it, but I guess I should say the ink has some character to it, and still nice and smooth. I don't know if you can tell from there, but it goes down fairly dark, but lightens as it dries. Next, I'll be writing with a Pilot Custom 98. It has a 14 karat number 3 size fine nib. Again, still very smooth. This gold nib is a fair bit wetter than the two steel nibs, and you may be able to see that the writing is noticeably darker between these two fine nibs. The gold nib is wetter and the letters are much darker than the fine nib. But they both felt similarly smooth. And I really like the color of my custom 98 with this Syo Ro. Now, I don't know how this will come across in the video, but this pen is an interesting color. It's a dark green with just a bit of blue in it. I guess a very dark teal, and I'm really liking it with this ink. Normally, I'm not very matchy-matchy with my pens and inks. I prefer an ink with a complementary or a contrasting color, but this is just too nice to pass up. Next, I'll be writing with a Pilot Explorer. It has a stainless steel medium nib. Now the steel nib is noticeably drier than the gold one before, and you can feel it in the writing. It's still smooth, but I could feel there wasn't as much ink. I wouldn't say that it felt dry. It just felt drier than the gold nib. Still smooth. Now, I have used this Explorer with a medium nib in a couple different Filofax notebooks. And Filofax paper is not known for being very fountain pen friendly, but I found this medium nib, it was just dry enough to write nicely on that Filofax paper. The Explorer is my favorite pen to use with my Filofax clipbook because I can slide it into the binding. It just works perfectly. Next, I've got a Pilot Custom Heritage 91. It has a 14 karat medium nib. This medium nib is substantially wetter than all the previous nibs, and for this small ruling, these small grids, it's not my favorite to write with. When I write with this medium nib, I use 2 grids per line of text, but for quicker writing and larger writing, this is a very nice wet nib that can keep up easily, and this is very smooth. I like this ink in this wetter nib. I would enjoy using this in a larger ruling. Next, I'll be writing with a Pilot Metropolitan. It has a stainless steel CM nib. This calligraphy medium nib, the steel nib, can feel kind of dry with some inks, but this was very smooth, felt very nicely. But this nib, that stub nib, spreads the ink out, and you can see when you compare it to that medium nib, the ink is a bit more pale. I prefer the darker, wetter nib, but this still looks fairly nice. It's just not my favorite, but it was very pleasant to write with. Probably the smoothest nib so far. Next, I've got a Kaweco Lilliput. It has a stainless steel broad nib. Now that we're getting into the broader nibs, I don't know if you can see in this writing sample, when this ink goes down on the page, it is bright. It looks almost like Konpeki, but as it dries, the green starts coming out and it looks much more subdued and faded. Again, here's the same theme, very smooth. And finally, I'll be writing with a Jinhao X750. It has a 1.5 stainless steel stub nib. Very smooth and luxurious feeling. While this dries, I'll take a look at some of the other writing samples. On this Rhodia grid paper, the writing sample that I did with the glass and dip nib was very smooth and very uniform until I got to the S, and then I just had to rotate the nib a little bit to get an edge that still had some ink on it. That was very pleasant and looks very nice and crisp. The ink swatch, just like on the Tomoe River paper, is pretty uniform in color. It gets a little bit lighter down here at the end, but it's very crisp and it held onto the paper very nicely. I don't see much sheen on this paper like I did the Tomoe River, but I do see a little bit of halo in the writing samples, and everything was smooth. It wasn't till I got down to the Pereira that I started noticing the feedback, but it was still, for a fine nib, very pleasant and enjoyable to write with. On the Custom Heritage medium nib, I saw some of the shading in there. That's very nice looking. I'm not a fan of writing on copy paper with fountain pens usually, and in the wider nibs and the wetter nibs, as you wrote, you could see the ink feathering just almost immediately after you wrote. So on the Kaweco, the reverse writing was very pleasant. So that's something, if in a pinch, if you need to do some writing, you can check and see if reverse writing is an option. The steel nibs, specifically the stub nib, was very pleasant because it spreads the ink out so you don't have as much ink concentrated in one place, so it didn't feather quite as much. You didn't see the ink spreading as you were writing, and it was very smooth. So that one was nice. The gold nibs just felt like the ink was blobbing out because there's so much ink that this absorbent paper just sucks it out of the nib. So I preferred the steel nibs. Another one of my favorites was the medium, and kind of like the cursive medium, it spreads that ink out so you don't have as much ink concentrated in one place to feather. So the medium was nice. The Pereira was okay, but the Kakuno was very nice. If you want a fine nib, that extra fine was the way to go. There's so little ink going down in one place that you didn't notice. I didn't notice any feathering. But if you want a wider nib, probably the best was the Metropolitan, followed by that steel medium nib. This is fairly thick copy paper, but there was some noticeable bleed through with the wider nibs. But overall, not bad. Syo Ro is one of those inks that's difficult to describe. It's bluish green. Now it's appearing very blue in my viewfinder. Again, we'll have to see if I'm able to correct that. But when I started writing with this, I noticed that it looked very similar in color to my Custom Heritage 98. And so I thought, I want to compare this to Diamine Green Black, which was my previous favorite ink to use in the Custom 98. And when you compare these two, it really makes this Syo Ro look blue. So as I was flipping through my inks looking for comparables, I came across Vert Atlantide, and when I look at Vert Atlantide compared to other greens, I really see the gray and maybe a little bit of blue coming out, but when I compare these two, it really makes the green in this one come out. I also wanted to compare it to Sukiyo because, like I mentioned, when the ink first goes down, it's very blue. Now, when I put this blue ink in real life, it makes this look very green. Now, I'm not seeing it as much in the viewfinder, but this looks much more green now. And I came across two Lamy inks. I would say that Syo Ro is in between Amazonite, which has more blue in it, and Peridot, which leans more green. This is kind of in between these two. As I was using this, I thought of that new 743, the Pilot 743 Verdigris, and so I compared it to Jacques Herbin Verdigris. Both of these have a bit of green in them. It's like Syo Ro is more saturated and just has a little bit more green in it, just a bit more. Let's see. Yamadori is slightly more blue. Robert Auster River of Fire was surprisingly similar. It doesn't look similar at all in my viewfinder though, but in real life, they do look surprisingly similar. And the closest ink I had to it was Colorverse Pale Blue Dot, which came in the Voyager series. I believe that was called the Voyager series. It was my first set of Colorverse inks. It came in a little set of 4 15-milliliter bottles. And I've had very good luck with this ink. I like to use it in fine nibs like my Platinum 3776 with a fine nib. That very fine nib, it just makes that nib feel very smooth, and it writes very crisp, similar to these fine nibs with Syo Ro. And they're very similar in color, though through the viewfinder, this one's looking much more blue, but in real life, they are very similar. I did a writing sample on rhodia paper and let it set for a little bit and dry. Then I submerged it in water for 10 minutes, and there is a very legible blue layer that was left behind, but it did kind of blow out, which takes away a little bit from the legibility, but still not bad. It makes me wonder if I would have let it dry even longer. I think I let it dry for maybe between 30 minutes and an hour. Makes me wonder, though, if I would have let it dry longer, if there would have been less of the blue blowing out. All right, let's take a look at the back of the Tomoe River paper. No bleed through, none even really coming close, even on the heavier sections. And I don't really have anything bad to say about this ink. The only thing that really stood out to me as being surprising was how blue it was coming out of the nib and how different it looks when it dries. Now, there was one other thing I wanted to show. This ink looks different on different papers. Let me get... Okay, I can't remember the name of the paper from my ink collection cards. I'll have to insert that when I edit. But can you see the difference there? This looks like two different inks. It looks much more turquoise, more blue in it on the Tomoe River paper, and it looks more green, more teal on this ink collection card. I found that interesting. And let's see, on the rhodia paper, I feel like it's kind of in between. It still looks more blue, and it looks more green on the ink collection card.